Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we are here for another installment of what I hope is going to be a long-running series here on the channel as we go through opening paragraphs. Opening paragraphs are absolutely critical to the novel writing process, to the short story writing process, and the flash fiction process, the novella process. Why? Because it tells you a lot of what you need to know about a story right up front, whether you know it or not. Again, I will use the quote from Neil Gaiman, who said that the second draft is to make it look like we knew what we were doing all along. In this way, if you read an entire novel and then you go back to the very first paragraph to a well-crafted book, it will tell you a lot more about what is going on in that book than you previously realized. And why that's important for a second reading is it's going to restoke all of those fires necessary to get meaning out of the text. But today we are here with The Call of the Wild by Jack London. The opening paragraph to this reads as such. Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing, not alone for himself, but for every tidewater dog, strong of muscle and with warm, long hair, from Puget Sound to San Diego. Because men, groping in the Arctic darkness, had found a yellow metal, and because steamship and transportation companies were booming the find. Thousands of men were rushing into the Northland. These men wanted dogs, and the dogs they wanted were heavy dogs, with strong muscles by which to toil, and furry coats to protect them from the frost. One more time, just so that we've got it. Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing, not alone for himself, but for every tidewater dog, strong of muscle, with warm, long hair, from Puget Sound to San Diego. Because men, groping in the Arctic darkness, had found a yellow metal, and because steamship and transportation companies were booming the find. Thousands of men were rushing into the Northland. These men wanted dogs, and the dogs they wanted were heavy dogs, with strong muscles by which to toil, and furry coats to protect them from the frost. So there's a lot going on in this opening paragraph. But what's most important? The most important thing that we have here in this opening paragraph is the introduction of Buck. Buck is a good old doggo. And he's not just a dog. Buck's a big dog. We get that here, and it's important to know that because not always in literature is a visualization of the protagonist necessary. Especially, not is it always necessary to the plot and to the story. But here it is. Here it is absolutely necessary. Had Buck been born a Chihuahua, well, Call of the Wild never happens at all, does it? So it's absolutely necessary that we have this visualization of Buck as a big dog. And because of that, we are reminded twice of Buck's size and coat. Once it is told to us that he is big and he has a warm coat. The second time, it is told to us that these men who are journeying into the north want just that type of dog. So we have the fact that Buck is necessary to some aspect of this story. Buck is essential, and Buck's size and coat are essential to what's going on. Buck's strength is essential to what's going on. And we're going to see a lot more from all of these things later. Another thing that stands out in Jack London in general, but especially, I think, in The Call of the Wild, is the normalcy of his language. What I mean by that is that there is nothing really out of time in this opening paragraph. There are no phrases which stick out. There is no fanciful prose. It is very straightforward. Hemingway-esque, right? If someone told you that Jack London was just a second name for Ernest Hemingway, if you've read his stories, that would kind of make sense to you. You'd be able to go with it. And here, that is absolutely necessary. The normalcy of language, but also the mundane nature of the introduction and a standard type of plot. All of these things are very necessary for a book that has the protagonist of The Call of the Wild. We're following a dog the entire time. That is with whom we'll ride. A dog, not always the easiest sell, especially in something that has for ever since it was written been considered literary fiction. Now, I think that, I don't know how long it happened, but I know that when I was a kid, this was sold as children's fiction. But there's a lot going on here that makes it literary fiction as well, that makes it a standard type of story, not just something for kids. And in fact, there are some things going on herein that might make it not suitable for more squeamish children. Animal abuse, for one. These are things that in modern day we've sort of gotten away from in our storytelling. But if you go back to when I was a kid, mid-80s through mid-90s, those were big parts of making a hero, was that hero went through something extraordinary. But here in this opening paragraph, though there is some normalcy of language, there is a mundane plot, there is a whole lot of, okay, I'm here with you. There's a whole lot of that going on, but there is still a foreboding tone. Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known. Right? There's a foreboding tone, but no sense of urgency. Why? Because we do not yet have our call to action. The very first sentence of the next paragraph, which I know, cheating a little bit, but not really, because we have the entire book after this, so we know that the second sentence comes. Buck lived in a big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. That's why there is a foreboding tone, but no sense of urgency, because the sense of urgency that will come is very, very, very far away from Buck as he stands, or as he rests leisurely. But the big thing, I think, that this first paragraph really does is that it sets up suspense. We get the phrase, trouble was brewing. A bit of a cliche, sure, but it does a whole lot of work. It tells us something is on the horizon. That gives us suspense. Suspense is heightened by stakes, that yellow metal which is found in these times. Stakes are raised by a villain. That villain, men groping in the Arctic darkness. Men groping in the Arctic darkness, what it's doing is it is letting us know that these men have lost something of their humanity. They're groping through the Arctic darkness. This is not where men should be. There is something primal to that. And these men who are resorting to something primal, well, they need dogs like Buck for something even more primal. The labor involved in this greed, the labor involved in this process which is driven by need and necessity and greed. Adding to the suspense and the stake and the villain, there's a larger villain at play. We have not just these men who have resorted to something primal, but we have another entity which has resorted to something more human than human. More human than human, right? Where are we here? Steamship and transportation companies were booming the find. So we have the presence of a totem. Buck at the very bottom. These men who were doing this searching using Buck, and then companies booming the find using the men using the Buck. So there are all sorts of things going on in this opening paragraph to the Call of the Wild, all sorts of things which are, in fact, extremely useful to the story. And we understand that on the first read. It's planted in there, and we know to look for it. But on a second read, we are ultimately cognizant of the fact that at some level, the events herein were sort of inevitable, which is how all good storytelling should sort of feel. Surprising but inevitable. So that is all that I have for this episode, The Call of the Wild by Jack London, in opening paragraphs. I hope to have you back next time as we go through some other opening paragraph through some other book.